On January 16, 1945, beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, Germany, a small group of men and women descend into a hidden world of concrete, steel, and artificial light. Above them, the capital of the Third Reich is beginning to collapse under the pressure of war. The streets that once carried the symbols of Nazi power are now filled with destruction. Buildings stand blackened by bombing. Windows have been shattered. The distant thunder of artillery is becoming a constant presence. Yet beneath the ground, behind reinforced walls, Adolf Hitler enters the final headquarters from which he will command a dying regime. This is the Führerbunker. Hidden beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, the bunker is not a fortress in the traditional sense. It is not a vast underground city designed to launch armies or survive indefinitely. It is a cramped network of reinforced concrete rooms built to protect the Nazi leadership from the increasingly devastating Allied air campaign. But in the final months of the Second World War, it becomes something far more significant. It becomes the last center of power of Nazi Germany, the place where decisions are made as the war moves towards its inevitable end. The corridors are narrow. The ceilings are low. The air is heavy with the smell of damp concrete, fuel, and ventilation systems working continuously beneath the earth. Electric lights replace daylight. The outside world exists only through reports, maps, and radio messages. Those inside are physically protected from bombs, but they are trapped within a reality that is rapidly disappearing. Above them, Berlin is under siege. By early 1945, Germany's military situation has become catastrophic. Soviet forces have crossed into German territory from the east, while British and American armies advance from the west. The once powerful Wehrmacht, which had conquered much of Europe only a few years earlier, is now exhausted. Its armies lack fuel, aircraft, ammunition, and trained personnel. Industrial production has been devastated by years of Allied bombing, and Germany's ability to replace losses is shrinking every month. Yet, inside the bunker, Hitler refuses to accept defeat. Maps spread across tables show imagined counterattacks and divisions that exist mostly on paper. Officers deliver reports describing collapsing fronts, surrounded armies, and desperate defensive battles. Outside, Soviet artillery moves closer to Berlin with every passing day. The distance between reality and the orders being issued underground grows wider. The Führerbunker itself has a history that reflects the changing fortunes of the Nazi regime. Construction began during the war as part of Hitler's growing need for protection from aerial attacks. The first structure, known as the Führerbunker, was completed in 1936 as an air raid shelter connected to the Reich Chancellery. As Allied bombing intensified, a deeper and stronger section was constructed between 1943 and 1944. This second level became the Führerbunker, designed with thick reinforced concrete walls capable of resisting the impact of heavy bombs. The complex was built approximately 8 meters below ground level. Its walls and ceiling were made from several meters of reinforced concrete, creating one of the most secure locations in Berlin. The bunker contained offices, sleeping quarters, communication rooms, a conference room, medical facilities, kitchens, and ventilation equipment. It was supplied with electricity and water systems designed to allow occupants to survive underground during air raids. But physical strength could not protect those inside from military defeat. The bunker's greatest significance came not from its engineering, but from the decisions made within its walls. During those final weeks, Hitler, his closest advisors, military commanders, secretaries, and personal staff experienced the collapse of the Third Reich from underground. Some remained loyal until the end. Others began preparing for survival. Some recognized that the war was already lost. The atmosphere inside became increasingly tense. According to accounts from people who survived the bunker, daily life continued with strange contradictions. Meals were prepared. Administrative work continued. Telephone calls were made. Reports were written. Yet all of this occurred while a battle for Berlin raged above them. The final chapter of Nazi Germany was unfolding in a place where ordinary sounds became reminders of approaching destruction. The hum of ventilation machinery filled the corridors. Telephones rang with messages from distant fronts. Explosions shook the ground above. Every piece of information carried the weight of a collapsing empire. The bunker was never intended to become a symbol of the end of an era. It was designed as a place of protection, a hidden command center where Nazi leaders believed they could continue directing the war. Instead, it became the final witness to a regime facing total destruction. The story of the Führerbunker is not the story of a great military victory or a secret weapon that changed the course of history. It is the story of a leadership trapped by its own decisions, surrounded by the consequences of years of war and destruction. And in the cold underground rooms beneath Berlin, as enemy forces closed in from every direction, the final days of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany were about to begin. By the beginning of 1945, the Führerbunker had become the center of a desperate struggle between illusion and reality. Above ground, the German capital was no longer the center of a powerful empire. It was a battlefield. The streets that had once hosted military parades and political demonstrations were now filled with rubble, abandoned vehicles, and civilians searching for shelter. Berlin's population faced shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies as the war reached its final stage. The situation that brought Hitler into the bunker was the result of years of strategic failures, military overextension, and decisions that had turned Germany's early victories into eventual disaster. In 1939, Germany had launched the Second World War with a series of rapid campaigns that appeared almost unstoppable. Poland was defeated within weeks. France collapsed in 1940. German forces reached deep into Soviet territory after the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941. The image of German military power seemed overwhelming, but the foundations of that success were weaker than they appeared. The invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, created a conflict on a scale Germany was not prepared to sustain. The Eastern Front stretched across thousands of kilometers, consuming men, equipment, and resources at an extraordinary rate. The German army faced not only Soviet forces but also the immense geographical challenges of the Soviet Union, including harsh winters, vast distances, and difficult supply conditions. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union quickly became one of the most important turning points of the war. The German advance slowed, then stopped. The defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 marked a devastating loss. More than 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner after the surrender of the Sixth Army, and the defeat destroyed the image of German military invincibility. From that moment, the strategic situation increasingly moved against Germany. At the same time, Allied industrial strength continued to grow. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union were producing enormous quantities of weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition. Germany attempted to respond through technological innovation and increased production, but it faced shortages of raw materials, skilled workers, and fuel. The Allied bombing campaign placed further pressure on German industry. Cities, railway networks, oil facilities, and factories became targets. While the effectiveness and impact of strategic bombing remain debated among historians, there is no doubt that Germany's ability to maintain its war machine was severely challenged by 1944 and 1945. The Führerbunker was therefore not the command center of a confident government. It was the final shelter of a leadership facing military collapse. By January 1945, Soviet forces had launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, one of the fastest advances of the war. Within weeks, the Red Army moved from positions in Poland to within striking distance of Berlin. German defensive lines were collapsing, and entire formations were being destroyed or forced to retreat. The Western Allies were also advancing. After the success of the Normandy landings in June 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of France and pushed eastwards into Germany. The failure of Germany's final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, between December 1944 and January 1945, consumed some of Germany's remaining reserves without changing the outcome of the war. Inside the bunker, however, Hitler continued to search for solutions that no longer existed. One of the greatest challenges facing the German leadership was communication between expectation and reality. Military reports often presented difficult situations, but Hitler increasingly responded with demands for counterattacks using units that were exhausted, destroyed, or unavailable. Officers who understood the true situation faced the impossible task of delivering bad news to a leader who refused to accept defeat. The bunker's reinforced walls could protect against bombs, but they could not stop the consequences of strategic decisions made years earlier. The physical construction of the bunker represented one of Germany's greatest engineering efforts in defensive architecture. The structure was part of a wider network of air raid shelters built throughout Nazi Germany as Allied bombing became more powerful. These shelters were designed according to the principle that survival depended on creating spaces capable of resisting enormous explosive forces. The Führerbunker's upper and lower sections were constructed using large quantities of concrete and steel reinforcement. The deeper command area was separated from the outside world by heavy blast doors and security systems. The ventilation equipment was designed to filter air and protect against smoke or chemical threats. Communication equipment connected the bunker to military headquarters and government offices across Germany. Yet the bunker's greatest weakness was not physical. It was strategic isolation. Those underground were increasingly separated from the reality experienced by ordinary Germans outside. Millions of civilians had already suffered through years of war. Millions of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Cities across Europe had been destroyed. The Nazi regime's policies had caused unimaginable suffering, including the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were murdered alongside millions of other victims persecuted by Nazi Germany. The final days inside the Führerbunker were therefore not simply the collapse of a military headquarters. They represented the destruction of a regime responsible for one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. The people inside the bunker still followed routines. Documents were prepared, messages were sent, guards maintained security, meals were served. But every passing day brought the war physically closer. By April 1945, the sound of Soviet guns could be heard in Berlin. The city that Hitler had imagined as the center of a 1,000-year empire was now surrounded and burning. The bunker, built to protect Germany's leadership, had become a sealed chamber where the final decisions of the Nazi state would be made. The question was no longer whether Germany would survive. The only question remaining was how its leaders would face the end. I will continue with P3, the next section of the documentary. I'll keep the script seamless and continue the same continuous prose style. By April 1945, the world above the Führerbunker had become almost unrecognizable. Berlin, once the political center of Nazi Germany, was now a city under siege. The Soviet Red Army was advancing through the streets, fighting block by block against the remaining German defenders. Buildings that had survived years of bombing were collapsing under artillery fire. Roads were filled with debris, abandoned vehicles, and desperate civilians searching for safety. Deep underground, however, Adolf Hitler and his remaining followers continued to operate from the bunker as if command of the war was still possible. The final days of the Führerbunker began with increasing isolation. Communications became unreliable. Telephone lines were damaged or cut. Military reports arrived from units that were surrounded, destroyed, or unable to carry out the orders they had received. The map room inside the bunker became a place where imaginary movements of troops were discussed long after the ability to influence events had disappeared. The bunker's staff worked under extraordinary pressure. Secretaries typed documents. Officers studied maps. Couriers carried messages through a city already being consumed by battle. The atmosphere was described by survivors as one of exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. Some understood that the end was approaching. Others remained committed to the belief that a final reversal was still possible. Among those still inside were senior Nazi officials, military officers, personal staff, and security personnel. The bunker was crowded, but the space was limited. Rooms designed for emergency protection were now permanent living quarters. The lack of sunlight, constant artificial lighting, and the vibration of explosions above created an environment unlike any ordinary military headquarters. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery fire was already reaching parts of Berlin. Outside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly, yet inside the bunker, a small gathering took place to mark the occasion. According to accounts from those present, the atmosphere was far removed from the grand celebrations that had once surrounded Nazi leadership. There were no signs of victory, only the reality of defeat approaching closer. The next day, Hitler received reports confirming that Soviet forces were moving into the city. His response was not surrender, but anger. He demanded counterattacks and blamed his commanders for failures that had become impossible to reverse. One of the final military formations placed at the center of these hopes was the German Ninth Army, which was already surrounded and collapsing east of Berlin. Hitler believed that relief forces could break through and save the capital, but the military situation made such plans unrealistic. Historians have noted that many of the units Hitler relied upon either lacked the strength, supplies, or position required to achieve the objectives demanded of them. The reality was simple. Berlin could not be saved. On April 22nd, during a military conference inside the bunker, Hitler finally acknowledged that the war was lost. According to surviving accounts, he declared that the battle was finished and announced his intention to remain in Berlin rather than attempt escape. This moment represented a turning point inside the bunker. The illusion of possible victory had ended, and preparations for the final hours began. Yet, even as defeat became undeniable, the consequences of Nazi rule continued. The regime did not collapse quietly. Orders continued to be issued. Soldiers and civilians were still expected to fight. In many areas, German troops were forced into hopeless resistance despite the obvious military reality. Above ground, ordinary people paid the price. Berlin's civilians faced shortages of food and water. Hospitals struggled to treat the wounded. Thousands of homes had been destroyed. The battle for the city became one of the final major confrontations of the European War, costing tens of thousands of lives among German and Soviet forces, as well as civilians. Inside the bunker, the final decisions of Nazi Germany were being made. On April 29, 1945, Hitler dictated his political testament and personal will. The documents reflected his refusal to accept responsibility for the destruction caused by his leadership. That same day, he married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a brief ceremony conducted underground. The following day, as Soviet forces fought increasingly close to the Reich Chancellery, Hitler and Braun died by suicide in the bunker. The exact circumstances of their deaths have been examined by historians for decades. Soviet investigations after the war recovered evidence from the site, although misinformation and political manipulation later created confusion about details. The broad historical conclusion, supported by witness testimony and available evidence, is that Hitler died in the Führerbunker on April 30, 1945, and his body was taken outside and burned according to his instructions. The destruction of the remains was an attempt to prevent his body from being displayed by enemy forces, but it could not prevent the collapse of the regime he had created. Within days, the bunker would be abandoned. Some occupants attempted to escape through the ruins of Berlin. Some were captured. Some died during attempts to reach safety. Others surrendered when resistance became impossible. The Führerbunker had survived the bombing that had destroyed much of Berlin, but it had never been able to protect the people inside from the consequences of war. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The story of the bunker was never only about concrete walls and underground rooms. It was about the final moments of a regime that had transformed Europe through conquest, persecution, and destruction. Beneath the surface of Berlin, history reached its conclusion in a place designed to preserve power, but which ultimately became a symbol of its complete failure. The final days of the Führerbunker did not end with a dramatic final battle beneath the earth. They ended with silence, confusion, and the slow disappearance of the people who had occupied the last center of Nazi power. Above ground, Berlin continued to burn. Soviet troops fought through the ruins of the city, while German defenders, many of them exhausted and poorly equipped, continued resistance despite knowing that defeat was unavoidable. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere changed completely after Hitler's death. The command structure that had controlled Germany for more than 12 years had effectively collapsed. The men and women who remained were no longer carrying out plans for victory. They were attempting to survive the consequences of a war that had reached its final moments. On May 1, 1945, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, and his wife Magda killed their 6 children before taking their own lives inside the bunker complex. The deaths of the children remain among the most disturbing events connected with the final hours of the Nazi leadership. Their deaths demonstrated the extreme ideological commitment and psychological collapse within the regime's inner circle. Other occupants began preparing escape attempts. Several groups tried to break through the Soviet encirclement of Berlin. Some succeeded in reaching American or British forces, while others were captured or killed. The city outside offered almost no safe route. Streets were destroyed, bridges were damaged, and Soviet forces controlled much of the area around the Reich Chancellery. The bunker itself was eventually discovered by Soviet troops after the German surrender of Berlin on May 2, 1945. Soldiers entered the underground complex and found abandoned rooms, documents, personal belongings, and evidence of the final days of the Nazi leadership. The physical remains of the bunker survived for years after the war, but its history became complicated. The site became part of divided Berlin, and authorities later removed much of the visible structure to prevent it from becoming a place of Nazi remembrance or pilgrimage. Today, the exact location of the Führerbunker is marked only by an information board near the former Reich Chancellery site. The underground rooms themselves are largely inaccessible, hidden beneath the modern city. The story of the Führerbunker has continued to attract historical investigation because it represents one of the most significant endings in modern history. It was not the place where the Second World War was won or lost. The outcome had already been determined on battlefields across Europe and through years of military decisions, industrial competition, and human sacrifice. The bunker was the final stage of a much larger story. The collapse of Nazi Germany was caused by many factors: the failure to defeat the Soviet Union, the strength of Allied industrial production, Germany's inability to replace military losses, strategic mistakes made by its leadership, and the overwhelming resources of the Allied powers. Compared with other wartime headquarters, the Führerbunker was unusual because it was not designed as a long-term operational command center like some Allied and Soviet facilities. Its purpose was primarily protection against air attacks. The Soviet Stavka headquarters, used for coordinating the Eastern Front, operated through a wider network of command locations. Allied headquarters, such as those used during the Normandy campaign, depended heavily on mobility, communication networks, and coordination between different branches of service. The bunker offered physical security, but it could not replace effective strategy. Its thick concrete walls represented engineering achievement, but they could not compensate for shortages of fuel, manpower, and military options. The German military had produced advanced weapons and demonstrated impressive technical ability during the war, but technology alone could not overcome the economic and strategic realities facing Germany by 1945. The same lesson can be seen in Germany's wider weapons programs. Projects such as advanced aircraft, rockets, and armored vehicles showed remarkable engineering ambition, but many arrived too late, in too few numbers, or under conditions where they could no longer change the outcome of the conflict. The Führerbunker, therefore, became a symbol of a broader historical truth. Military power depends not only on technology or individual weapons, but also on leadership, resources, logistics, and strategic judgment. Its long-term impact has been significant. Historians, military researchers, and political scholars continue to study the bunker because it provides a rare insight into the final moments of a dictatorship collapsing from within. The surviving documents, testimonies from bunker occupants, and post-war investigations have allowed researchers to reconstruct the events that took place during those final weeks. Museums and historical institutions around the world continue to preserve records connected to the period. Archives contain photographs, military documents, personal accounts, and official reports that help explain not only what happened inside the bunker, but also the wider consequences of Nazi rule. The site itself has become a reminder rather than a monument. It does not celebrate the people who occupied it. Instead, it stands as evidence of where unchecked power, aggressive expansion, and destructive ideology ultimately led. In the final analysis, the Führerbunker was never truly a fortress. A fortress suggests strength, permanence, and survival. The bunker provided protection from bombs, but it could not protect a collapsing regime from history itself. In the spring of 1945, beneath the streets of Berlin, a small group of people remained surrounded by concrete walls while an entire empire disappeared above them. The same city that had once witnessed Nazi demonstrations, military parades, and declarations of conquest was now reduced to ruins. The flags that had represented victory only years earlier had been replaced by smoke, rubble, and silence. The bunker's final hours reveal the contrast between appearance and reality. From the outside, it was a heavily protected command center. From within, it was a place where decisions were made long after victory had become impossible. It was built to preserve leadership. It became the location where leadership failed. It was designed to withstand destruction, yet it became a witness to destruction on a historic scale. The concrete walls remained standing beneath Berlin, but the world that created them was gone forever. The story of the Führerbunker is ultimately not a story about a hidden underground room. It is a story about the final consequences of choices made over many years. It is a story of a regime that promised domination but ended surrounded, defeated, and abandoned. On that final day in April 1945, as explosions echoed above the bunker and Soviet forces moved closer through the shattered streets of Berlin, history reached a moment that would never be forgotten. Beneath the ground, inside a few rooms of reinforced concrete, the final chapter of Nazi Germany came to an end. And when the smoke cleared, the bunker remained not as a symbol of power, but as a warning of how quickly ambition can turn into ruin, how easily certainty can become blindness, and how the decisions made by those in power can leave consequences that echo long after the walls themselves have disappeared.